Hello, folks. I think we already have enough attendance and we can start. Shashi will not be able to join. He had to run a personal errand. Can somebody shout out to see, ensure I'm audible?
I can hear you.
I can hear you as well.
Okay, I see a couple of items on today's agenda. Yeah, the first one being Paul, you have put that use cases for Federation programming load balancers. Do you want that to be discussed first? I think it's better we other items and then come to that. It might take a while in discussion.
Yeah, I think we were mostly interested in just kind of getting a feel from the group if people have use cases that they're interested in around around doing some basic programming of load balancers in a manner similar to how we have external DNS, reprogramming DNS. We have started to get some interest from our customers in doing that. And I just wanted to get a feel from the group whether this is something anybody had thought about yet, if folks had specific requests from people that were interested in using Federation, etc.
Yeah, if anybody else has a comment, they can go first. We have had some discussions about this earlier, so I can talk about that once others finish their comments.
Also, one question. So, what do you mean programming load balancer? What is the difference for the program load balancer with other load balancers?
Yeah, so I think the most fundamental essential use case is given a service that is deployed in multiple clusters that are fronted by a single load balancer somewhere, to reprogram that load balancer with a current set of endpoints that correspond to load balancers or externally addressable IPs for the clusters where the service is deployed, or rather for the service in each cluster. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so
Guangya, you can also think of it as provisioning a load balancer rather than using the name programming. You can say provision a load balancer. Just load balancer is just the way load balancer is provisioned in a cloud environment using
okay.
the CPI, the
I
cloud
see.
provider interface.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, I see that I mean, we are not getting other comments. So, see this, within our team at our group, we had multiple discussions about this earlier, and this keeps coming back. So, I'll just put some thoughts or conclusions that we had when we had these discussions. Is something on these lines. So, um, number one point is that we do not have each cloud provider has a different mechanism or different API to do this provisioning or programming. Okay, so a load balancer from any cloud provider can certainly be configured in such a way that it can direct traffic to any known public location. So, for example, a load balancer provisioned in Google Cloud can direct traffic to Amazon clusters also, to on-prem clusters also, given they are publicly reachable. Uh, in this case, security is one issue that we couldn't come across or wrap our heads around. Um, In other case, the more primary problem is that different load balancers have different API. I mean, there's no standard API which can be utilized. We can maybe think of using the K8s CPI, which is used by the K8s services when the load balancer is provisioned, but that's like jumping to solution or that kind of stuff. The one more thing we could think of is that rather than having a load balancer coming from a cloud provider or being provisioned from a cloud provider, why not have a software load balancer or an external load balancer running as an application somewhere else? There also we run into, there are problems with that also, which we couldn't wrap our heads around. So this is needed at Huawei. We certainly need this, and we have use cases where applications or the workloads which are deployed in multiple clusters, a central or a single endpoint is needed to reach those applications. But how, we have not been able to solve it, or we haven't come to think of a good solution for that.
Yeah, it's really convenient that for DNS, we already have this like independent building block in external DNS that knows how to program these different APIs. Yeah, I agree. There's definitely the challenges that you highlighted, Irfan, I think are very real. At this point, I would say I would characterize like our thinking as we want to understand exactly what use cases people have if they have them, and that is probably necessary information to inform any further steps.
I can talk about one use. You can go complete.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Maru or Ivan, I don't know if you guys want to add any color there.
Can it be some kind of one of the use cases of federation networking, for example, it's together with multi-cluster Istio and Cube CMI and maybe other things?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different technologies that might solve parts of this problem. I definitely think, like, to go back to something that Irfan mentioned, yeah, you could also look at building like a software load balancer that was independent of any particular cloud platform. I do think there are going to be like enterprise users that have existing like load balancer appliances and infrastructure that they ideally would want to use with Federation, but we're really just beginning to look at this, so still a lot of unknowns there for us.
Dario, if you were talking about, did you mean to ask that some use case be specified for this? Hello?
I think that was Alexei talking rather than Dario.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I just asked if it's maybe a private case of some kind of federation networking. It's together MCI and Istio, but
no, rather than actually networking across multiple clusters, the most simplified use case for this is that a user has deployed, or whichever category of user has deployed workloads across multiple clusters. They can be simple replica-based workloads, and replicas don't talk to each other. But for the users of that application, they need to reach to that application. So one mechanism is that if you have, say, 3 clusters, you provide 3 different endpoints. And it's the user's choice which endpoint it wants to connect. That's not a good solution. So a good solution, as of now, as of today, what happens is, that the application maintainers, they deploy a separate load balancing tier uh, somewhere. It might be outside the Kubernetes clusters. It might be outside the purview of Kubernetes itself. Separate load balancing tier is deployed as an application or provisioned through infrastructure, and that is used as a endpoint to reach out to those applications. What I think we are talking about is that giving a solution to that particular use case, or thinking about a solution for that particular use case. That, according to me, is the primary one.
I think as an action item that we can take away from this, I can record an issue that basically solicits if folks have use cases around load balancers, and we can see what people come up with to capture use cases that people might have.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay.
To add to the use case around having a single load balancer endpoint that would then target multiple endpoints that are distributed in different clusters, I think also of interest would be is see if users have use cases around being also routed to the nearest cluster that would be able to satisfy that request, the nearest healthy clusters. So that load balancer would also have to maintain some sort of mechanism to determine like least hops to clusters, as well as determine like the health state of those endpoints in those clusters.
Yes, that's correct, Ivan. So there are, I mean, all the other load balancing, you can say, features can be applied to this beyond. I mean, after the, I mean, if you have a solution for the first use case, after that, whatever load balancing features could be there, they could be like how to load balance, and as you mentioned, geographically nearest or minimum hop replica should be reached, or the cluster should be reached first. All those things can then be applied, like all those use cases applied to this.
So it's kind of global load balancer, correct?
Yes, you can say that.
Yeah.
And actually, as of today, some cloud providers provide a mechanism. For example, if you see the MCI, the multi-cluster ingress, uses the Google load balancer, the Google provision load balancers, and they have a lot of these features. And they understand multiple clusters, means that multi-cluster ingress can do some of these load balancing features and program the load balancer such that a single application can be reached through this Google load balancer to different clusters also. And there are some proprietary solutions also I know about which do similar stuff. Means a single cloud load balancer is provisioned, and that's the single endpoint to reach application which can span on cloud, on-prem, or to some other locations. But I don't know if there is a solution in this space with respect to Federation that we are talking about. Okay, so Paul, you will put an issue, and then we can continue our discussion over there.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and create the issue now.
Thanks for doing that, Paul. Should we move ahead, or are there any more points or comments for this?
Sounds like we can move on.
Okay. Okay, about the next point, I think Guangya added this. We have, I mean, we did talk about the 2.0, 0.2.0 release. I think it will be 0.0.2 release, right? Yeah, 0.0.2 release.
Yeah, I put that on there. I meant 0.0.2.
Okay, no issues.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so. I feel like it's been quite a while since we released a new version, and we've done a lot of work that some of which is still in progress. You know, we've added the DNS facility, and worked to make Federation deployable at the level of a namespace. I, so to be perfectly transparent, my team is working on a developer preview for OpenShift 3.11, which is coming up pretty soon, and we would like to use the most up-to-date version, which means we're very interested in releasing a new version soon after all the namespace changes are finished. I wonder how others are feeling about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we did discuss about this in last to last meeting, I guess, and I think what you're saying is reasonable.
Okay.
So what we took as action item in that meeting was that whichever features, one of us has to create a milestone. I simply skipped. I mean, that simply skipped my mind. Anyways, we can take that as an action item that post this meeting, we'll create a milestone and tag PRs or issues which need to be part of that milestone, and then we can track it.
Okay. Does someone have the action item to create the milestone?
I'll do that.
Okay. All right.
I already created one.
Okay, cool. Go ahead then. Great.
Talking about 002, right?
Yeah. I
I
didn't
created that after
notice
last
that.
week's
I didn't
meeting.
notice that. Okay, cool. Okay, and Guangya, I think you did mention these things like there are some examples or documentation that might be needed to be completed before this release.
Yeah. I hope
Yeah.
that we can add more examples because Federation WG already support many different kind of Federation resources, but in the example, we don't have enough resources for people to do some tests. Yeah.
Okay. Others, how do you feel? Does it need to be mapped to the 0.2 milestone?
I think so, yeah. Because in 0.0.2 release, we may need to claim that we also add some new features. And if people want to test those new features, and they may want some examples to test. So I think that it will be great if we can add the examples that's introduced in this release.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. And also one more question. So do we have some plan for how to release this 0.0.2? Do we release it in Helm chart or in YAML template?
Yeah, I would say that we, based on what I remember from last week, I think our consensus was that we would use the Helm chart.
Okay. Yeah, and currently the Helm chart is ready for review. And I also create another PR which is using a script to generate all the CRD resources.
Yeah, I saw those. We should make sure that those get reviewed since we will need those as part of our release process, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and I did put up one item next to this, which is so any PRs which you think need help or support, please list it out over here, and we can assign a reviewer to them now.
Yeah, so I have just post the link here, the link in Google Doc.
I think your charts PR is already being reviewed, Gwangya. I think Shashi did review it and Paul did
Yeah,
review it.
I already addressed the comments from Shashi, and I hope that I can get more comments from others as well.
Okay. You mentioned that you have one more PR, right? Which is auto generation of
Oh yeah,
the charts YAML.
yeah, but no. Currently, I only have a PR which can help to generate all the CRD resources. Let me. Yeah, I also put the link, and
Okay.
this PR will have to generate all the CRD resources used by Federation.
Okay, I'll take a look at this today. But this might not be necessary for the order to
Yeah.
release.
Yeah. And also another question is, I think that we also have some discussion for, we want to update the latest tag to reflect to the master branch, and because we don't want to use the latest tag to map to the latest release, but want to map it to the latest to the master branch.
Do you mean to say image tag?
Yeah, image tag, because I also need to yeah.
So the we have a Travis job set up that will build new images when we tag the repo. So when we do the GitHub release and release 0.0.2, it pushes a tag to the GitHub repo, and Travis picks that up and then builds a new tagged image for that version.
Yeah.
Yeah, Paul, I guess there was a mismatch over there. So any or the latest version that is built is tagged as canary, right? Whereas
yeah, to go into just a little bit more detail. So when we push, when new commits are made to the master branch, we rebuild the canary tag. When we tag a when we tag a release, like when we do a GitHub release, it pushes a tag with the name of the release to the GitHub repo, and Travis picks up that new tag and will do an image build for that specific tag. So like if we merge a pull request to master, for example, it puts a new commit in master and Travis will rebuild canary. If we do a release or otherwise push a tag to the repo, Travis will do an image build for the name of that tag. Does that make sense, Irfan?
yeah, this is understood, Paul. There was only one problem with this, that the usage of latest tag. So generally in documentation or in normal cases, you see people tend to ignore the tag of the image. So if the tag of the image is ignored, it will by default use latest as a tag.
Yeah.
And that
So,
latest ideally should be the head of master, not the latest release. That I think we discussed about it, and that needs to be updated.
so latest. Sorry, I thought we talked through this another way. Canary represents the latest master branch. Like it's the canary in the coal mine, so to speak. And latest represents the last released version.
Yeah, if that seems suitable to everybody, then that's fine to me.
Yeah. So when and to add a tiny bit of missing detail that I should have added before, when we push a new tag to the repo, so when we tag 0.0.2, Travis will rebuild. It will build an image with tag 0.0.2, and it will update the existing latest tag to point to the same SHA. So latest moves when we release new versions. Canary moves when we merge stuff to master.
Cool, understood.
Okay.
Okay, next item is put by Gwangya about RBAC in Federation V2, or uh, do you want to elaborate a little bit about this, Gwangya?
Yeah.
What exactly do you mean? Do you mean to federate the RBAC API, or your meaning is something else?
Yeah, so I have just posted the Google Doc in the link on perhaps let me share. I will share my desktop. Yeah, so today I just create a draft document for how to use Federation for how to use RBAC in Federation V2. So first we can take a look at the background. So the background is as following. Currently, Federation, all the clusters are hosting one namespace, and all users in the host cluster can access all the member clusters. So the problem here is that there are some requirements that different users may have different requirements or may have different permissions to access a group of clusters in the multi-cluster environment. So here, I think that we should have some kind of RBAC to enable different users have different permissions to access all the member clusters. So here the proposal is that I think that we should have a two-level RBAC. So the first level is host level RBAC, and the second level is member cluster level RBAC. So basically for the host cluster level RBAC, and we need to check if the user is able to create or view or access the resources in a specific cluster. And this RBAC is handled by the host cluster. So this is the first level. And the second level is that the member cluster need to check if the user is able to create or view or access the resources in a specified namespace in the specified member cluster. So the RBAC is handled by the member cluster for the member cluster RBAC part. So
I can understand like your rationale for the host cluster stuff. Makes sense if you want to have differential permissions for people interacting with Federation. So, for example, a user that can, create a federated deployment can't necessarily join a cluster. That makes sense. Yeah. What it's not making sense to me is when you're talking about member cluster RBAC, there are two interactions of Federation as it exists in V2. One is joining a cluster, which involves creating a service account, setting up the permissions, etc. And the second is all the controllers use that service account. So what I'm not seeing is a justification for the member cluster RBAC, since there's effectively no way to police things on a user basis. Like there's a document that I'm not sure if you've seen that was formulated by members of Federation V1 last year, and we never got to a satisfactory conclusion because it's actually a really hard problem. Are you familiar with that document?
Yeah, but I think that I still have one question. So currently, I think that every user can add a member cluster into Federation control panel. So I think that maybe
I'm not disputing the possibility that consumers of Federation might want to have RBAC permissions separating people joining clusters versus manipulating Federation primitives. So I'm not arguing with you there at all. I think that's a reasonable case. It's more that when you talk about RBAC at the member cluster level, I think it's technically really difficult, and I don't really see the point. If I can manipulate a Federation primitive at the level of the Federation control plane, why do I need to police that at the member cluster level?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. Currently in Kubernetes, if we want to add a new node into the Kubernetes cluster, and then the Kubernetes need to and then the Kubernetes will have some check to see if it is able to join the Kubernetes cluster. So currently for Federation, I think that maybe we also need to add some checking to see if a member cluster is able to join the Federation control plane.
Isn't
But
that the responsibility of kubefed join? I mean, it'll succeed or fail
yeah,
based on the permission of the authenticating user.
yeah, you're right.
I mean, effectively, federation, like there's two modes, and the admin mode is there has to be someone with basically cluster admin who's joining the cluster, because the federation control plane expects to have cluster admin.
Yeah.
The namespaced work sort of narrows that focus so that if there was a desire for, like, these users are going to have, you know, access to these clusters and these users are going to have access to these clusters. In the namespace case, there is a possibility of restricting federation to a single namespace that has permission only to that namespace. And so, I mean, it's kind of in the nature of the way Kube API machinery works. You either have all namespaces or one namespace, but it's really hard to do multiple namespaces, just the way that informers work. And so effectively, like, it's either federation on the namespace level and people can run like each their own controllers and their own namespaces, or just a global thing. The side effect of this is that we don't really have to worry about like granular RBAC control in the member clusters. We give all permissions if it's going to be a cluster admin sort of installation or cluster level federation, or we give selective permissions for namespaces. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I still have one question. So perhaps we have one user here, and this user is able to create resources in class 1, but this user is not able to create resources in the namespace of namespace 1 in class 1. So after this user create a federated deployment using the federation control panel, and then after the request was sent to class 1, and we will not able to check if the user is able to create resources in this namespace or not. So
right,
I think
that's kind of a limitation of how federation is implemented. And like I said, like the way that informers work means it's all or nothing. You either have a single namespace or all namespaces. And so what this means is if a user needs selective access, they really need to, like, if you want to enforce selective access, then going with a namespace-based deployment is pretty much your best option. Like we could add, like, we could update the controllers so that they could operate on a per namespace basis, but it would add a huge amount of complexity. And it doesn't really solve the problem any better than just running, you know, a controller per namespace. Like there's a certain amount of overhead associated with that, but I think we really need definitive user like demand for selective like permissions before we go and add a huge amount of complexity to the sync controllers to deal with RBAC in the way that you're suggesting. And like I said, if you haven't read the user, like I'm trying to remember what the document was called, and I'll fish it up and post it to you over Slack if you haven't seen it. But the idea of like impersonating a user to the underlying clusters and having some way of federating authentication. And I mean, there's such big implications to this that I think we backed away slowly from that suggestion. And I'm happy to sort of revisit it, but I don't think the landscape has changed. I don't think the way that Kubernetes handles authentication is any more tractable from our perspective. So I mean, if you have use cases that aren't being solved by, you know, either namespacing or like global, then I mean, let's define those use cases clearly and investigate the cost of serving them and see if, you know, if they're genuinely things that we can't handle today with either namespaced or global.
So a couple things. I would say just like let's all be clear that like if you want to implement this type of RBAC mechanism, you could implement this with like a validating webhook. I will say though that I don't know that this is going to match actually the permission setup that a lot of customers have and then I also have some background in dealing with issues of like identity between Kubernetes and external systems that make me think that I'm not sure that that this setup as suggested would be especially usable. So when I see this, what I think of is like, it sounds like what you're proposing is that you add basically something in admission that that does a subject access review check using the identity of the identity that's creating the federation resource in the host cluster for federation against the target clusters, and that identity is not what federation is going to use to actually create it. So you can think of identity basically as like terminating at federation, and then the identity that is used by federation, at least with push propagation, is the one that's configured on federated cluster. And I don't think there's a reason to assume that they're going to be the same. So this might match like a deployment plan that some folks might have, but I don't think this would be universal in terms of how people expect RBAC to work. Does that make sense? Like that you would be performing this subject access review check using a different identity from the thing that's actually going to go and create it.
Also, you mentioned that we can use a webhook to do the checking.
Yeah, you could implement this on your own and set up a validating webhook for federation resources if you wanted to. There's nothing to there's no reason not to do that if this is something that you want to build for yourself to use. But I don't know that this would be a match for how people actually expect RBAC to work in most cases.
Yeah, I actually think that the federation should have its built-in RBAC logic so that the people will not need to do any extra works if they want to have this feature. I mean that we should have some built-in logic to support RBAC for federation.
I mean, RBAC for the federation control plane makes sense. I mean, you can limit who can access, who can create federation primitives in any given namespace. And then if you're using like the global, like if you're joining a cluster globally, then the access is on the federation side. The controllers would still have global access and could do whatever they needed to do in the member clusters. But if you could like limit access to the primitives on the host cluster, then you effectively control access to the underlying clusters.
Yeah, and you can do that with RBAC as it is today without introducing anything new, right?
Yeah. Mauro, so you have just mentioned that we can run multiple federation controllers.
Yeah,
so that,
I mean, you can't run, you can't run cluster scope federation multiple times because they would just step on each other. But if you're running it in namespace mode, you can run as many as you want.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but I think that maybe we still need to have this support to the federation controller can manage clusters in different namespaces because the cluster registry already make the clusters as namespace. So I think that we can leverage this feature to enable that the clusters can be created in different namespaces.
So if you want to, so to be really clear, if you deploy federation in a namespace way, like federation will handle one namespace. So if you want to provide federation type services to some namespace foo, you run federation in namespace foo, configured to look at namespace foo. If you want it in namespace bar, you run it there too. So if you can run on a namespace by namespace level, you just run an additional controller for each namespace that you want to handle. And you can run it in that namespace. If you want, you can run it outside that namespace and configure it to look at the namespace that you want it to handle and give it permission to do so, right? I think eventually we could look at giving groups of namespaces to a single controller, but I don't think we need the complexity for now.
I mean, being able to, I'm assuming the idea is that, oh, like this namespace is where this this department is going to add their clusters, and this namespace is where this department is going to add their clusters. And I mean, I just don't see cluster addition being like in the near term that big a deal. Like having an admin do it doesn't seem especially costly. And the challenge is that if you have like different departments clusters as part of one federation, how do you control access to those clusters? Like today, if a cluster is available to the federation, anyone can send data to it. And I think what you're suggesting is that you want it to be selective. You know, these users can add these clusters, and then only those users can federate to those clusters. And I think that really fits better with like a namespace deployment model, where you just say department X, you know, has namespace X. They're going to run their federation, and they're going to target, you know, that namespace and those member clusters. I guess that doesn't really, I don't know, maybe that's not what you're looking for. If you want to be able to have those users having complete control, they might actually need separate control planes, because it's really hard to sort of, like federation really wasn't designed to be like, oh yeah, there's going to be a differential level of access to the clusters available to the federation. It's, you can control the resources that go to the clusters like on a namespace basis, but the idea that you would have like department X would have these clusters and only they could federate that, that's not really a model that would be easy to serve. Like, I don't think it's just a matter of RBAC, it's a matter of the way the controllers are architected. Is this a use case that you see as important?
Yeah.
Like, is there a reason that this model is necessary versus just like running separate control planes for different departments? If they have entirely different federations.
Yeah, but one concern is that if we run multiple federation controllers, and then it may need quite a lot of resources on the host cluster.
Well, what I'm suggesting is if you want to have like cluster level federation, and you want to have different departments having entirely disjoint sets of clusters that they're federating to, that really suggests that you run a control plane per department, not that you have a control plane that serves all departments. Right, because it doesn't have to be, like a host cluster doesn't have to be a super big thing. It could be simply like, you know, an API server. Like it doesn't actually even have to run workloads if you don't want it to.
Oh, yeah.
And in that case, I mean, you could run an API server on top of Kubernetes. That's how Federation V1 ran. So you could have, you know, this is the control plane for department X. This is the control plane for department Y. They're just running as, you know, controllers on a Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah.
Just to give you food for thought, because the complexity of what you're suggesting seems considerable to me, and I think it might be worth exploring alternatives.
Yeah, so if we can run multiple controllers in host cluster, and then we will have the RBAC out of box for now. And I think that we will not need any code change, but only need to run multiple controllers. And then we will have basic RBAC, right?
Are you talking about running like namespace controllers?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if that works, that's great. That's kind of the use case that the namespace work was trying to approach, was allowing sort of a level of granularity of federation. So the PRs for that are, I think they're technically complete. They need review and getting merged, and then we need docs for it. Yeah, I think most of the work is done.
Okay. Yeah, so you mean that once your PR got merged, and then we will have RBAC feature if the customer can run multiple controllers in the host cluster?
I mean, we don't have explicit, you know, RBAC configuration for this, but I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's an easy enough step just to say, you know, you have, if you give a user, for example, cluster admin, which I think is necessary just to a namespace though, I think
Yeah.
that's sufficient. And so, I mean, you could have differential permissions where some people could add clusters, other people could, but I mean, that's kind of an implementation detail. It would really depend on the user, how they wanted to configure that. And probably
Yeah.
out of the box, I mean, I guess this is something you could work on to have out of the box, like this is just global. You can also apply these permissions that are more granular as you've suggested in your doc.
Yeah, so I think that if the users can run multiple controllers in the host cluster, and then the left task will be, they may need to create some cluster rules and then create some cluster rule bounding for the users or for some groups, and then they will have RBAC for the federation.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you're doing a namespace, you can provide whatever selective RBAC permissions you want on a namespace basis.
Yeah, great. So do you think that we need some document to tell the customer that if they want to have some kind of like RBAC, and then they may need to run multiple controllers in different namespaces, or like
Yeah, I
some
mean,
best practice? Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I have a good sense of what users actually want to do, but probably it would be helpful to, you know, if you want to have things controlled, like not just globally and, you know,
Yeah,
sorry, I'm just
because
trying to reconcile.
currently in the document, we actually don't have anything to tell the customer that we can run multiple federation controllers in one host cluster.
Right. I mean, that's a work item for the namespace work. And
Yeah.
so as part of
Okay.
like completing that issue, that is definitely a requirement to have documentation so people know how to use it. And you're raising the point that having not just documentation of how to use it, but maybe the why and you know, if you're going to use this here, or if you're thinking about this kind of problem, here's a solution to your problem versus this is just here how you deploy it in a namespace fashion. So I'd be welcome your reviews on whatever doc updates I end up pushing and contribution. If you feel it's lacking, then maybe you can describe some of your use cases and pointing to the configuration involved.
Okay, sure. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think I think that we already have a basic solution for RBAC, so I think that we can finish this document. And I will try to update the document a bit based on today's review meeting and have more detail for how to enable RBAC. Perhaps this will be a pure document work, maybe.
Yeah, Guangya, I have also put in the links. I think that they were put in chat also to the older work that was done similar to what you were alluding in this document, just to have a look at the associated complexity with that.
Oh, okay, sure. Let me copy.
Maru, one more thing. Actually, I mean, can you just brief about your work and PRs? Like until yesterday, I saw a couple of PRs with "Do Not Merge" label. So I was not sure if I should necessarily go and check them. So, I mean, if you can just give a brief, it'd be easier for me to have a look at them and
Sure.
understand.
So I mean, I leave PRs in work in progress, which means don't review them so long as they depend on previous PRs, just so that you're not reviewing stuff that could change due to
Exactly,
dependencies.
exactly. So that's the reason I always skipped those PRs so far.
Yeah. So, I mean, the reason all of them were put in work in progress was because there were test failures that were coming out. They were related to the dependency flake that Shashi had reported and everybody was experiencing for quite a while. And there were just there was all kinds of bugs in the testing that were only being revealed by deployment testing and coming out when I was testing twice. So as of 2.16, which is supporting deploying namespace control plane, which is ready for review, it actually runs two sets of tests. It actually deploys in a cluster scoped, deploys a cluster scope federation, runs the tests, and then it deletes that, and then it deploys a namespace federation, and then it runs the tests. Thankfully, a lot of the work that I did troubleshooting the errors revealed a lot of room for speeding things up. So the test execution will actually not take any longer than it did before, even though it's running tests twice now.
Okay.
But yeah, so I mean, hopefully if you review that PR, you'll get a sense of what's involved. I mean, deploying namespace is relatively trivial. You just pass some flags to deploy federation. And you do have to make sure that you're not already running a cluster scope federation, because they will, understandably step on one another. My next step is just getting docs in place so it makes sense, but hopefully as a developer you can review that PR and notice what's being added and how CI is executing it to be able to get a sense of how to play with it yourself. But it effectively means that you can deploy federation to a single namespace, and the follow-on PR 230 actually restricts permissions so that it doesn't actually have cluster scoped anything, it's just in a namespace. And then when you join a cluster to this federation, you also have to pass limited scope to indicate you're going to create a service account that has cluster scoped only for that namespace, not for the whole thing. And there has been some talk a while ago, this is just dragging a little bit, but talking about maybe providing configuration for federation in the namespace so it's discoverable, so that when you create a namespace federation and then you join it, all you have to do is specify the namespace of the deployment, and then it'll discover the fact that it's limited scope and create the service account appropriately. And maybe that's a topic we can talk about maybe next week, because it's not just for namespace federation, that's a convenience, but also how are we configuring federation in general? The idea that you always have to pass flags is kind of annoying.
Yeah, usage, the UX part of it also matters.
Yeah, and it also sort of impacts deployment, like the operator work that we're doing at Red Hat to be able to preview federation to our customers. There's been discussion about the need to have a canonical source for configuration rather than just passing flags around or editing deployments. I think we have an issue for that, but kind of running out of time today. But I'm hoping maybe we'll have more sort of work done by next week, and we can discuss it as a group to move towards either an API type or a config map or just something, so that we have a place to configure things across different tooling.
Sure, we can have a discussion around that.
Cool. Any other questions about namespace federation?
Nope. I just wanted to know the status because I actually saw the list of PRs was getting larger, and I tried to review a couple of them, but I always skipped your PRs because they had do not merge label on it. So
right. Yeah, I'm hoping I'd like to get 216 and 230 merged, and then I've been kind of holding off on reviewing the service account support one, just because I'd like to just get the namespace stuff in and then modify other PRs versus constantly having to rebase. But definitely would like to get this moving this week.
Does 216 depend? Are 216 and 230 orthogonal, Maru?
No, 230 depends on 216, which is why it's work in progress. So don't review until we get 216 merged.
Okay.
Because 216 gets things deployed in a namespace fashion, but it doesn't actually provide restricted permissions. You still need cluster admin just because of the way the federated type config controller was architected. And so 230 rewrites the federated type config controller to not use shared informers, which you can't really restrict to a namespace. And then when it deploys it, it makes sure that everything is just in the namespace. So that represents the state that I would be comfortable giving to a user. saying you could safely deploy this on a production instance. It's not going to destroy things. It's only going to, the havoc it can wreak is limited to the namespace.
Cool. Thanks for all this work, Manu. Yeah, relating to the number of growing PRs, Paul, there were a couple of PRs that you raised relating Go docs, and I see that there are some open comments on them. I did post a couple of comments myself.
Yeah,
Go ahead and close them, please.
Yeah, I had to deprioritize those over last week, but they are in. I have intended to complete them this week.
Cool, thanks.
And Irfan, since we're talking about PRs, I think there were mention on needing reviewers on some of those PRs. Feel free to add me on any of those PRs that need reviewing
Sure.
that were discussed previously.
Sure, we'll do that. So I'll. That's what I was trying to do. I did that last week. This week I didn't go through the PRs again. So I'll go through. My only concern was the growing number. So I just saw. I think today there are some 17 open PRs, which is which is okay. But I mean, if there are some PRs which need necessary or are just waiting for reviewers or somebody to blocked on a single entity, we can mention it over here. That's what my intention was.
I would also call out 260, which fixes bugs that I created and then tried to fix and didn't quite fix.
Sure.
Thanks to Guang for pointing out that I actually didn't quite finish the job. Hopefully it's in good shape now. And we need to merge that ASAP because tree is actually in an inconsistent state with respect to how overrides are handled.
Okay. I can probably spend some time on this today.
Great.
Okay. So, yeah, and I think we had a fruitful discussion today. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
See you guys next week. Bye-bye.
All right,
Thanks.
see ya.
Bye.
Ciao.